Hey everyone, it's Lola. I hope you all have had a wonderful holiday break, and I hope that your New Year's is going to be good. I got this book for Christmas. It was on my Christmas list, and my brother got it for me. And I thought, after I read the first few pages, that it might be good to read to you all. It's called A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and it has to do with feminism, so take that as you will, I guess. It's actually interesting because it was written in the 1920s, so it's not a modern text, but it's actually still pretty relevant. I'm a little nervous about reading for a video. I decided I would do the first chapter of this, but it's still that long. This long, rather. So, I really hope that you will all be forgiving for my flubs as I read through this, because I'm not great at reading long text at once, out loud at least, because my mind sort of trips over the words, and yeah, so I hope that you will forgive any mistakes, because I am going to try to keep it small, or keep the mistakes small, and hopefully it will still be relaxing, even with some minor flubs. Here's the intro. This essay is based upon 2 papers read to the Arts Society at Newham and the Otta at Girton in October 1928. The papers were too long to be read in full and have since been altered and expanded. A Room of One's Own, Chapter 1. But you may say, we asked you to speak about women and fiction. What has that got to do with a room of one's own? I will try to explain. When you asked me to speak about women and fiction, I sat down on the banks of a river and began to wonder what the words meant. They might mean simply a few remarks about Fanny Burney, a few more about Jane Austen, a tribute to the Brontes, and a sketch of Haworth Parsonage under snow. Some witticisms, if possible, about Miss Mitford, a respectful allusion to George Eliot, a reference to Miss Gaskell, and one would have done. But at second sight, the words seemed not so simple. The title Women and Fiction might mean, as you may have meant it to mean, women and what they are like, or it might mean women and the fiction that they write. Or it might mean women and the fiction that is written about them. Or it might mean that somehow all 3 are inextricably mixed together, and you want me to consider them in that light. But when I began to consider the subject in this last way, which seemed the most interesting, I soon saw that it had one fatal drawback. I should never be able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fill what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer, to hand you, after an hour's discourse, a nugget of pure truth to wrap up between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever. All I could do was to offer you an opinion upon one minor point. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And that, as you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved. I have shirked the duty of coming to a conclusion upon these two questions. Women in fiction remain, so far as I am concerned, unsolved problems. But in order to make some amends, I'm going to do what I can to show you how I arrived at this opinion about the room and the money. I'm going to develop in your presence, as fully and freely as I can, the train of thought which led me to think this. Perhaps, if I lay bare the ideas, the prejudices that lie behind this statement, you will find that they have some bearing upon women and some upon fiction. At any rate, when a subject is highly controversial, and any question about sex is that, one cannot hope to tell the truth. One can only show how one came to hold whatever opinion one does hold. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions, and as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. Fiction here is likely to contain more truth than fact. Therefore, I propose, making use of all the liberties and licenses of a novelist, to tell you the story of the 2 days that preceded my coming here, how, bowed down by the weight of the subject which you have laid upon my shoulders, I pondered it, and made it work in and out of my daily life. I need not say that what I am about to describe has no existence. Oxbridge is an invention, so is Fernham. I is only a convenient term for somebody who has no real being. Lies will flow from my lips, but there may perhaps be some truth mixed up with them. It is for you to seek out this truth and to decide whether any part of it is worth keeping. If not, you will of course throw the whole of it into the wastepaper basket and forget all about it. Here then was I, call me Mary Benton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or by any name you please. It is not a matter of any importance. Sitting on the banks of a river a week or two in fine October weather, lost in thought. That collar I have spoken of, women in fiction. The need of coming to some conclusion on a subject that raises all sorts of prejudices and passions, bowed my head to the ground. To the right and left bushes of some sort, golden and crimson, glowed with the color, even it seemed burnt with the heat of fire. On the further bank, the willows wept in perpetual lamentation, their hair about their shoulders. The river reflected whatever it chose of sky and bridge and burning tree, and when the undergraduate had oared his boat through the reflections, they closed again completely, as if he had never been. There one might have sat by the clock, round, lost in thought. There one might have sat the clock round, lost in thought. Thought, to call it by a prouder name than it deserved, had let its line down into the stream. It swayed, minute after minute, hither and thither, among the reflections and the weeds, letting the water lift it and sink it until, you know, the little tug, the sudden conglomeration of an idea at the end of one's line, and then the cautious hauling of it in, and the careful laying of it out. Alas, laid on the grass, how small, how insignificant this thought of mine looked. The sort of fish that a good fisherman puts back into the water so that it may grow fatter and be one day worth cooking and eating. I will not trouble you with that thought now, though if you look carefully you may find it for yourselves in the course of what I am going to say. But however small it was, it had, nevertheless, the mysterious property of its kind. Put back into the mind, it became at once very exciting and important, and as it darted and sank, and flashed hither and thither, set up such a wash and tumult of ideas that it was impossible to sit still. It was thus that I found myself walking with extreme rapidity across a grass plot. Instantly, a man's figure rose to intercept me. Nor did I at first understand that the gesticulations of a curious-looking object in a cutaway coat and evening shirt were aimed at me. His face expressed horror and indignation. Instinct, rather than reason, came to my help. He was a beetle. I was a woman. This was the turf. There was the path. Only the fellows and scholars are allowed here. The gravel is the place for me. Such thoughts were the work of a moment. As I regained the path, the arms of the beetle sank. His face assumed its usual repose, and though turf is better walking than gravel, no very great harm was done. The only charge I could bring against the fellows and scholars of whatever the college might happen to be was that in protection of their turf, which had been rolled for 300 years in succession, they had sent my little fish into hiding. What idea it had been that had sent me so audaciously trespassing, I could not now remember. The spirit of peace descended like a cloud from heaven, for if the spirit of peace dwells everywhere, it is in the courts and quadrangles of Oxbridge on a fine October morning. Strolling through those colleges past those ancient halls, and the roughness of the present seemed smoothed away. The body seemed contained in a miraculous glass cabinet through which no sound could penetrate, and the mind, freed from any contact with facts, unless one trespassed on the turf again, was at liberty to settle down upon whatever meditation was in harmony with the moment. As chance would have it, some stray memory of some old essay about revisiting Oxbridge in the long vacation brought Charles Lamb to mind. St. Charles, said Thackeray, putting a letter of Lamb's to his forehead. Indeed, among all the dead, I give you my thoughts as they came to me. Lamb is one of the most congenial, one to whom one would have liked to say, "Tell me then how you wrote your essays," for his essays are superior even to Max Beerbohm's, I thought, with all their perfection, because of that wild flash of imagination, that lightning crack of genius in the middle of them, which leaves them flawed and imperfect, but starred with poetry. Lamb then came to Oxbridge, perhaps 100 years ago. Certainly he wrote an essay, the name escapes me, where the manuscript is one of Milton's poems which he saw there. It was Lycidas, perhaps, and Lamb wrote how it shocked him to think it possible that any word in Lycidas could have been different from what it is. To think Milton is changing the words in that poem seemed to him sort of sacrilege. This led me to remember what I could of Lycidas, and to assume myself with guessing which word it could have been that Milton had altered, and why. It then occurred to me that the very manuscript itself, which Lamb had looked at, was only a few hundred yards away, so that one could follow Lamb's footsteps across the quadrangle to that famous library where the treasure is kept. Moreover, I recollected, as I put this plan into execution, it is in this famous library that the manuscript of Thackeray's Esmond is also preserved. The critics often say that Esmond is Thackeray's most perfect novel, but the affection of the style, with its imitation of the 18th century, hampers one so far as I can remember, unless indeed the 18th century style was natural to Thackeray, a fact that one might prove by looking at the manuscript and seeing whether the alterations were for the benefit of the style or of the sense. But then one would have to decide what is style and what is meaning, a question but here I was actually at the door which leads to the library itself. I must have opened it, for instantly there issued, like a guardian angel barring the way with a flutter of black gown instead of white wings, a deprecating, silvery, kindly gentleman, who regretted, in a low voice, as he waved me back, that ladies are only admitted to the library if accompanied by a fellow of the college, or furnished with a letter of introduction. That a famous library has been cursed by a woman is a matter of complete indifference to a famous library. Venerable and calm, with all its treasures safe locked within its breast, it sleeps complacently, and will, so far as I'm concerned, so sleep forever. Never will I wake those echoes, never will I ask for that hospitality again, I vowed as I descended the steps in anger. Still an hour remained before luncheon, and what was one to do? Stroll on the meadows, sit by the river. Certainly it was a lovely autumn morning. The leaves were fluttering red to the ground. There was no great hardship in doing either, but the sound of music reached my ear. Some service or celebration was going forward. The organ complained magnificently as I passed the chapel door. Even the sorrow of Christianity sounded in that serene air more like the recollection of sorrow than sorrow itself. Even the groanings of the ancient organ seemed lapped in peace. I had no wish to enter, had I the right, and this time the verger might have stopped me, demanding perhaps my baptismal certificate, or a letter of introduction from the dean. But the outside of these magnificent buildings is often as beautiful as the inside. Moreover, it was assuming enough to watch the congregation assembling, coming in and going out again, busying themselves at the door of the chapel like bees at the mouth of a hive. Many were in cap and gown. Some had tufts of fur on their shoulders. Others were wheeled in bath chairs. Others, though not past middle age, seemed creased and crushed into shapes so singular that one was reminded of those giant crabs and crayfish who heave with difficulty across the sand of an aquarium. As I leaned against the wall, the university, indeed, seemed a sanctuary in which are preserved rare types which would soon be obsolete if left to fight for existence on the pavement of the Strand. Old stories of old deans and old dons came back to mind, but before I had summoned up the courage to whistle, it used to be said that at the sound of a whistle, old professor instantly broke into a gallop. The venerable congregation had gone inside. The outside of the chapel remained. As you know, its high domes and pinnacles can be seen like a sailing ship always voyaging, never arriving, lit up at night and visible for miles, far away across the hills. Once, presumably, this quadrangle with its smooth lawns, its massive buildings, and the chapel itself was marsh too, where the grasses waxed and waved, where the grasses waved, and the swine rootled. Teams of horses and oxen, I thought, must have hauled the stone in wagons from far counties, and then with infinite labor the grey blocks in whose shade I was now standing were poised in order one on top of another. And then the painters brought their glass for the windows, and the masons were busy for centuries up on that roof with putty and cement, spade and trowel. Every Saturday, somebody must have poured gold and silver out of a leathern purse into their ancient fists, for they had their beer and skittles, presumably of an evening. An unending stream of gold and silver, I thought, must have flowed into this court and perpetually to keep the stones coming and the masons working, to level, to ditch, to dig, and to drain. But it was then the age of faith, and money was poured liberally to set these stones on a deep foundation. And when the stones were raised, still more money was poured in from the coffers of kings and queens and great nobles to ensure that hymns should be sung here and scholars taught. Lands were granted, tithes were paid, and then when the age of faith was over and the age of reason had come, still the same flow of gold and silver went on. Fellowships were founded, lectureships were endowed. Only the gold and silver flowed now, not from the coffers of the king, but from the chests of merchants and manufacturers, from the purses of men who had made, say, a fortune from industry, and returned in their wills a bounteous share of it to endow more chairs, more lectureships, more fellowships, and in the university where they had learned their craft. Hence the libraries and laboratories, the observatories, the splendid equipment of costly and delicate instruments, which now stands on glass shelves, where centuries ago the grasses waved and the swine rootled. Certainly, as I strolled round the court, the foundation of gold and silver seemed deep enough. The pavement laid solidly over the wild grasses. Men with trays on their heads went busily from staircase to staircase. Gaudy blossoms flowered in window boxes. The strains of the gramophone blared out from rooms within. It was impossible not to reflect. The reflection, whatever it may have been, was cut short. The clock struck. It was time to find one's way to luncheon. It's a curious fact that novelists have a way of making us believe that luncheon parties are invariably memorable for something very witty that was said, or for something very wise that was done. But they seldom spare a word for what was eaten. It is part of the novelist's convention not to mention soup and salmon and ducklings, as if soup and salmon and ducklings were of no importance whatsoever, as if nobody ever smoked a cigar or drank a glass of wine. Here, however, I shall take the liberty to defy that convention and to tell you that the lunch on this occasion began with soles sunk in a deep dish, over which the college cook had prepared a counterpane of the whitest cream, save that it was branded here and there with brown spots like the spots on the flanks of a doe. After that came the partridges, but if this suggests a couple of bald brown birds on a plate, you are mistaken. The partridges, many and various, came with all their retinue of sauces and salads, the sharp and the sweet, each in its order, their potatoes, thin as coins, but not so hard, their sprouts, foliated as rosebuds, but more succulent. And no sooner had the roast and its retinue been done with than the silent serving man, the beadle himself perhaps in milder manifestation, set before us, wreathed in napkins, a confection which rose all sugar from the waves. To call it pudding, and so relate it to rice and tapioca, would be an insult. While the wine glass had been flushed yellow and flushed crimson, it had been emptied, had been filled. And thus, by degrees, was lit halfway down the spine, which is the seat of the soul, not that hard little electric light, which we call brilliance as it pops in and out of our lips, but the more profound, subtle, and subterranean glow, which is the rich yellow flame of rational intercourse. No need to hurry, no need to sparkle, no need to be anyone but oneself. We are all going to heaven, and Van Dyke is of the company. In other words, how good life seemed, how sweet its rewards, how trivial this grudge, or that grievance, how admirable friendship and the society of one's kind, as lighting a good cigarette, one sank among the cushions in the window seat. If by luck there had been an ashtray handy, if one had not knocked the ash out of the window in default, if things had been a little different from what they were, one would not have seen, presumably, a cat without a tail. The sight of that abrupt and truncated animal padding softly across the quadrangle changed by some fluke of the subconscious intelligence the emotional light for me. It was as if someone had let fall a shade. Perhaps the excellent hawk was relinquishing its hold. Certainly, as I watched the Manx cat pause in the middle of the lawn as if it too questioned the universe, something seemed lacking. Something seemed different. But what was lacking? What was different? I asked myself, listening to the talk. Sorry, my dog is barking. Hold on a second. And to answer that question, I had to think myself out of the room, back into the past, before the war indeed, and to set before my eyes the model of another luncheon party held in rooms not very far distant from these, but different. Everything was different. Meanwhile, the talk went on among the guests, who were many and young, some of this sex, some of that. It went on swimmingly, it went on agreeably, freely, amusingly. And as it went on, I set it against the background of that other talk. And as I matched the two together, I had no doubt that one was the descendant, the legitimate heir of the other. Nothing was changed, nothing was different, save only here I listened with all my ears, not entirely to what was being said, but to the murmur or current behind it. Yes, that was it. The change was there. Before the war, at a luncheon party like this, people would have said precisely the same things, but they would have sounded different, because in those days they were accompanied by a sort of humming noise, not articulate, but musical, exciting, which changed the value of the words themselves. Could one set that humming noise to words? Perhaps with the help of the poets one could. A book lay beside me, and, opening it, I turned casually through Tennyson, and here I found Tennyson was singing. There had fallen a splendid tear from the passion flower at the gate. She is coming, my dove and my dear. She is coming, my life, my fate. The red rose cries, she is near, she is near. The white rose weeps, she is late. The larkspur listens, I hear, and the lily whispers, I wait. Was that what men had hummed at luncheon parties before the war? And the women? My heart is singing. My heart is like a singing bird whose nest is in the watered shoot. My heart is like an apple tree whose boughs are bent with thick-set fruit. My heart is like a rainbow shell that paddles in a halcyon sea. My heart is gladder than all these because my love has come to me. Was that what women had hummed at luncheon parties before the war? There was something so ludicrous in thinking of people humming such things, even under their breath, at luncheon parties before the war, that I burst out laughing, and had to explain my laughter by pointing at the Manx cat, who did look a little absurd, poor beast, without a tail, in the middle of the lawn. Was he really born so, or had he lost his tail in an accident? The tailless cat, though some are said to exist in the Isle of Man, is rarer than one thinks. It is a queer animal, quaint rather than beautiful. It is strange what a difference a tail makes. You know the sort of things one says at a lunch party breaks up, and people are finding their coats and hats. This one, thanks to the hospitality of the host, had lasted far into the afternoon. The beautiful October day was fading, and the leaves were falling from the trees in the avenue as I walked through it. Gate after gate seemed to close with the gentle finality behind me. Innumerable beetles were fitting innumerable keys into well-oiled locks. The treasure house was being made secure for another night. After the avenue, one comes upon a road, I forget its name, which leads you, if you take the right turning, along to Furnham. But there was plenty of time. Dinner was not till 7:30. One could almost do without dinner after such a luncheon. It is strange how a scrap of poetry works in the mind and makes the legs move in time to it along the road. Those words. There has fallen a splendid tear from the passion flower at the gate. She is coming, my dove, my dear. Sang in my blood as I stepped quickly along towards Headingley, I'm not sure. And then, switching off into the other measure, I sang Where the Waters Are Churned Up by the Wear. My heart is like a singing bird, whose nest is in the water's shoot. My heart is like an apple tree. What poets, I cried aloud as one does in the dusk. What poets they were. In a sort of jealousy, I suppose, for our own age, silly and absurd though these comparisons are, I went on to wonder if honestly one could name two living poets, now as great as Tennyson and Christina Rossetti were then. Obviously it is impossible, I thought, looking into those foaming waters, to compare them. The very reason why that poetry excites one to such abandonment, such rapture, is that it celebrates some feeling that one used to have at luncheon parties before the war, perhaps, so that one responds easily, familiarly, without troubling to check the feeling or to compare it with any that one has now. But the living poets express living poets express a feeling that is actually being made and torn out of us at that moment. One does not recognize it in the first place. Often, for some reason, one fears it. I think I might stop soon. Often, for some reason, one fears it. One watches it with keenness and compares it jealously and suspiciously with the old feeling that one knew. Hence the difficulty of modern poetry. It is because of this difficulty that one cannot remember more than 2 consecutive lines of any good modern poet. For this reason, that my memory failed me, the argument flagged for want of material. But why, I continued, moving on towards Headingley, have we stopped humming under our breath at luncheon parties? Why has Alfred ceased to sing, She is coming, my dove, my dear? Why has Christina ceased to respond, My heart is gladder than all these because my love has come to me? And I'm going to stop there. It's about halfway through the chapter. Continue with another video reading this, please See you next time.